name is Nicole, and I work with the Women's Center. My role there is the Community Development Coordinator. And today I'm going to be presenting along gendered lines. We're just looking at how to approach community development along a gendered lines, and how, if you take that approach, how that reduce or, get rid of inequities in community development. Sorry if I stutter a little, don't mind, just a little bit nervous, but hopefully as I go through this, I'll get better. So good morning and welcome again. So we'll just get started. Okay, maybe if I push this, then we can get started. So the agenda for today, how do I make this thing go on the top so it's not all right? Good. For today, again, I already did my welcome, and I just want to do like a quick land acknowledgement. I know Leanne did that this morning when she started, but I just want to acknowledge that we're on the Treaty 7 territory, the home of the Nitsitapi, which comprises of the Siksika, the Bigani, and the Gainai peoples. I want to acknowledge the Satina Nations and the ERA Nakoda, which consists of the Shiniki, Bear Spa, and the Goodstoni. Calgary or Mohkinstsis is home of thousands of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people. And as a non-Indigenous person, I think it's my responsibility that I acknowledge those who have been taking care of this land for millennia. So as we continue throughout the day, we just want to ground ourselves in the fact that we are guests. If you're not Indigenous, we're a guest here or we're visitors. So while we work, play, and sleep and do whatever we do, let's ensure that we honor those who have been here before us and who have been caring for this land. Is it the AC? Sorry. Okay, so just as we go into looking at like a gendered approach, so I just want to give an outline. So today we're going to be looking at an overview approach. We will look at gender mainstreaming. We look at different strategies. We'll do some defining and looking at the importance of a gendered approach for to community development. So before we get started, I just want you to reflect on this concept or this thought. All right, so you're baking a cake, and this is to make a cake. What are some of the key ingredients that you need to make the cake? So to make a cake, you have flour, you need eggs because that's going to be a part of your binding agent. You need baking powder because that's going to be like your raising agent, butter, and those other things. But some of the key ingredients is your flour, whichever one you choose to use, whether it's plant-based or it's regular wheat flour. So you're making your cake, and this cake is for a fancy party. But the egg is left out. They didn't give you any egg and they didn't give you any flour. So ponder on that and how you're going to make this cake. Whichever the type of flour or whatever the binding agent, whether you're not using egg because you're probably vegan, but you're using another. But imagine that those two ingredients are left out of the conversation or they're left out of the process of you making the cake. So I just want you to reflect upon that while we go through this process and just think how you're going to be making this cake and what's going to happen, what that cake is going to look like. All right, and again, you can't do any substitution because these are the key ingredients. So flour, whichever type, egg, whatever that binding agent is, those two are not a part of the conversation any at all. You're not taking those into consideration, but you must make this cake. So for the sake of this conversation, I just want to use this opportunity to define a few concepts. So the concept of equity and equality, and we tend to use them interchangeably when we're talking about gender and gender work, but they mean two different things. So equity, that refers to fairness and justice. And that is very different from what equality is. So equality, where you're providing the same things to everybody. So whether you're disabled, you're blind, you can't walk, you're able-bodied, whatever state you are. Equality means you're running a race. We're all starting from the same point. You're in the race. Equity, what equity does is recognize that we all cannot start at the same place. We all need different things in order to function in society. So we are acknowledging those things, and what we're doing is to give you what you need to create balance when we're doing anything. A gendered approach. So when you look at a gendered approach, so gender, when we talk about gender, it oftentimes refers to man and woman, and it look at the social construct of what's supposed to be a man or what's supposed to be a woman, and those things that are oftentimes culturally relevant to how we view gender. So when you take a gendered approach to community development, what it does, it recognizes and identifies that within the different gender binaries, because today I want to include other genders in this space outside of the standard man and woman. So within the different gender binaries, we have different needs, we have different experiences, perspectives. So when you use a gendered approach to community development, what that does is help to address inequalities that exist within community development initiatives. It is I must note that it is important that we have to take into consideration that as we operate outside of these differences, what that does is that it creates social and economic inequalities in society. So a gendered approach to community development, when you're looking at that, there are some key considerations that we need to take into play. So we look at like a gender analysis. So what that does is you're looking at these different genders that exist and how you're taking their needs into consideration. So you're doing a specific analysis of people's needs and wants. Another thing that you need to take into consideration is inclusive participation. And we don't want to say inclusive because we can say inclusive, but to be meaningful when we say inclusive. So you're ensuring that there is equal participation. And that's where also equity would come into place, because you need to ensure that folks along different lines or different socialization or economic status, that they have what they need so that they are able to participate. That's how we create inclusive participation. So creating gender sensitive programming. So what you're doing there is you're designing programs that address the specific needs for the different genders. So as a woman, as a self-identified woman or cisgendered woman, a woman's economic empowerment. We know that women are backbones of society. We make up what, more than 50% of the society. So we're the backbone, right? So how are you taking into consideration my need? How are you taking into consideration other gender diverse needs? How are you looking at how men's engagement in something like childcare, which oftentimes is assumed that that's woman's work, right? How we can also challenge gender stereotypes, how we build partnerships. So in building partnerships, community work is collaborative. There is no individuality in community work. And we often find that when we take that approach, that's where you see it failing. Or you do something and you think, because I make this thing or I do this thing, then people will show up. And that's not how community work. There are so many things that we have to take into consideration. And the next aspect is having gender responsive or gender sensitive budget. So what you're ensuring is that budgets, when you create budgets, it is allocated, those resources are allocated equitably. That will help to address gender specific needs. We oftentimes find that when you see like budgeting, oftentimes social services cut. Who do we find? Things like health, education, who we find that is on the periphery or the outside edges of these things, women or other gender diverse folks, right? So these are some of the things when we're thinking about a gendered approach, these are some specifics that we need to ensure that are included in that space. Sorry, can I have water, please? Yeah, please. Sorry. All right. So understanding gender gendered community development. So within this part, we'll look at some key concepts on how we define those. So gender refers to the characteristics, I said that earlier, of men, women, boys, girls. And these are socially constructed norms. So these are specific behaviors. Okay, girl, we're supposed to wear pink, or boys, you're supposed to wear blue. You know, all those fancy things that we associate with a specific with whether you're born with a vagina or you're born with a penis, right? So on how we socially construct these behaviors that goes with those two, with your genitalia. Sorry, back. Technology is failing me today too. So community development is described as a conscious technique or process that helps to solve social change or social problems. Thank you. Sorry, my nervousness is drying my mouth. This process enables community to collectively confront and act on common values and problems. Hamilton in 1992 defined community development as a planned and organized effort to assist individuals to acquire the attitudes, skills, and concepts required for their democratic participation, effective solution of a wide range of community improvement problems, as well as possibly in order of priority determined by their increasing levels or competence. The role of gender. How do we look at the role of gender in community development? Gender plays a major role in how society is shaped. It shapes how we experience things, the opportunities that are presented to us, and the different outcomes that we see happen within society. So you could look at like women's participation in like leadership, or on like things like board, like our voices are absent. Oftentimes, if we could travel to is maybe the north of us, sorry, I don't know geography, but like to the United States, when they revoke the abortion, Roe v. Wade, like you have a bunch of men sitting there making decisions about women's bodies, right? And what we are supposed to do with it, however we choose. But then it is not fit. It would be hypocritical of me to say if a woman was there, the result would have been different, because we oftentimes ask for representation of women or other gender diverse folks in spaces. But we have to be careful of doing that, because sometimes we have these people in spaces, but they buy into, or they're so socialized into the common construct of what happens, that they make decision along lines that doesn't fit the fact that they are women, or they're from the 2S LGBTQ2IA communities. So when we are saying we want representation, we have to ensure that the representation understands our reality or sits where. I could use something like, okay, going to bed hungry. If you tell that to some people, like that to them makes no sense. They cannot identify with that. So if you're saying you're putting someone like that in a space and thinking that they're going to make a good decision as it relates to food insecurity, it might not, because that is outside of that person's lived reality. And not to say that you only need lived reality, but some people can only identify with things that they've experienced. So we have to, ensure that when we're asking for these kind of representation, or even within community development, that the right voices or the right people are within the right space. So gender influences socialization, it influences education, work, economy, politics, leadership, family relationship, a gamut of everything that happens in society. It is all along gendered lines. It is pivotal that we recognize and understand and address that these dynamics, in order to improve society, that these dynamics, we have to strike a balance. We have to ensure equity. And with doing that, then there is, to me, automatically inclusivity. So what does a gendered approach look like? we talk about some of those at the top of the slide, but in terms of a gendered approach, we have to ensure that there's inclusive decision-making, gender-sensitive programming. We want to challenge gender stereotypes. We want to acknowledge safe spaces. Personally, I have a problem with safe spaces, but then I can see how people who want that kind of thing can exist. I much prefer a brave space terminology, and that's the one I tend to use more often. And we have to think about capacity building. And again, within capacity building, that is meeting people where they're at and not just saying it loosely, but actually put into place. Because let's talk about something like accessibility. Like if I have to ask for something, for instance, like we're doing this now, it'd be nice if we had someone who does sign language, or we have captions at the bottom. So those things we enable so that if someone comes in and that's where they're differently abled, they don't have to ask for these things. Because to me, accessibility means it's present. I don't need to ask, because it shouldn't be accessible. Like somebody don't ask for a ramp and I go out and roll out a ramp. So when you say it's handicap accessible, the ramp is already built. That's already constructed within the building code and all of that. So it's there. So that makes it accessible. If I have to ask personally, and this is just my view, you can disagree. If you have to ask, then that means it's not accessible. So importance of a gender perspective in community development. You might wonder, or you might ask the question, oh, why do I need to consider a gendered approach? Like, oh my God, I'm so tired of this gender crap. Pardon my language, but that might be some of our thoughts. But in absence of doing that, what you find is that we leave a lot of people out of conversation, processes, policies, and which we can see happens daily in government, in organizations, how we do things, and we don't take into consideration or use a gendered approach to making these kind of decisions. Sometimes it can feel like it's a lot of work or it's a lot of lip service, but it's important that when we're doing community work, we are taking this approach. Okay, so why it is important that we consider this approach is that if we take this approach, it will address inequality. It promotes inclusive decision-making, and you'll find that some of the same things are being repeated over and over. It just goes to show the importance of using a gendered approach. You are able to meet specific needs. You're able to challenge stereotype, and we do have a lot of stereotypes in society, right? So wherever we come from, it doesn't matter if we think, oh, I'm in Canada, this is a first world. Hey, I've seen more stereotype here that I probably see from my home, right? So wherever we are in society, as long as there's people, there's going to be stereotypes, right? It helped to enhance program effectiveness. Sorry, we're not sure what that is, but hopefully it's not too loud. It empowers women on other marginalized genders. It helps to build stronger community. It encourages engagement of dominant genders. Oh my God. It fosters social justice by integrating these different perspectives into community development. Okay, so we want to look here now at the importance of gender equality or equity in community development. So we talk about social and economic benefits of gender equality. So what we find is that within society, when we take this approach, how we develop our thoughts and our frame, not that we want homogeneousness in how we think, because society thrive. If we were all the same, life would be very boring, right? It would not be like, okay, my kids think when I was born that there was only black and white. I don't know what age was that, but if we were only black and white, life would be very boring. We need different shades, we need different colors. So in terms of economic benefits, how are we providing access to women? How are we ensuring that other marginalized genders have what they need in order to survive. If we look at things like, for instance, like homelessness or even youth homelessness in Calgary, more than 50% of youth who are unhoused are from the 2S LGBTQ sect. There must be something like, how do we ensure that economically, these folks who could, they are high schoolers, they're learning, how can they contribute successfully to society if we don't ensure that economically they're provided with the different things that they need to survive or to live whatever quality of life, because we must recognize that quality of life means different things to different people. Someone might be unhoused who doesn't want to be housed because that's their life, that's where they find family, that's where their community is. But if they want to be housed, how are we ensuring that there's provision within the space to help them to develop, right? Inclusive participation. And again, we keep saying that, and not just saying again, inclusive participation, but ensuring that we're going to the people who have the voices. And in terms of inclusive participation, I find that sometimes when we say inclusive participation, that means we're calling everybody together and we're doing a town hall. That works for people, but personally, for me, that we can be more inclusive, or we can find more dignified way to get people to talk about things that's affecting them instead of doing it like that. And then we'll see that as being inclusive, but there are other things that align that. And that's just my personal view. How are we giving space to diverse voices? Sometimes we create spaces and we say, oh, this space is diverse, or, blah, blah, blah. We say all these fancy terminologies because it's easy. We can do a checkbox, or it makes us, when someone come to my website, it looks like I'm diverse, but then what happens when those persons are in those spaces? Is there safety? Are people able to be brave? Are people able to be themselves? So when you give space to diverse voices, you're going to recognize that there's going to be diverse opinions. There are going to be diverse thoughts. There are going to be things that goes against your belief, whether it's personal, cultural, religious. There are going to be things. How are you bringing yourself within that space, and how open are you to actually listen and listen diversely, if there's such a thing? I'm just making up that one as I go. So how are we addressing specific needs of different genders? Working at the Women's Center, and so we say we would often use women identifying. So personally, I've started to move away from saying woman identified, because within that, I'm othering folks who probably in my socialization are not women. So I started to remove from that. So I'm just saying women, or we use participant. I've spoken to folks who are like non-binary. Physically, they are women presenting, but they would say that the Women's Center is not a space for them. That in my head, when I hear that, I'm like, what is the Women's Center though? We give basic needs. Everybody needs that, but it goes way deeper than that. So in order to address that specific individual and anybody who falls within that margin with that person, I would need to have conversations with that group of people or other marginalized gender to find out what are their specific needs. And then that's how we would work to create specific program that caters to the needs of those particular community. I'm Jamaican. It doesn't mean that because I want to have jerk chicken and rice and peas, that doesn't mean that every Jamaican is going to want that when they come to an event. So even within your own country, there are subset within each communities. How do we address those specific or those subsets of, it can be a lot of work, and we even shouldn't be thinking about it, because in community work, it should be more about like collaboration and wanting to do the work for the long haul. And then sometimes that's why we might experience things like I'm going to use improper, but that's probably not the correct word right here, but improper facilities or improper initiatives that comes into being because we're not listening. We're just doing things like off the top of my head. So I used to be in a space where you come and you tell me something, and my immediate go-to is that I want to fix your problem, not realizing that people don't need us to fix their problems, right? So how are we ensuring that I'm not creating something because I think that's what people want? And the only way to do that is to listen to the voices that we're creating these things for. How does what's the importance of gender equality in community development? How does that impact on community resilience and sustainability? I put this word in there, and I know I struggle with resilience. These are just some words that these days, like I find that oftentimes with marginalized peoples and marginalized gender, this resilience can be like a chokehold, because people are expecting us, to use this word to, like, it's so pull yourself up by the bootstrap kind of mentality. But I just throw it in there because within the sense of community, I just wanted to use that because then I'm looking at community as a collective where there is inclusion of all genders, races, creed, religion, wherever you are sitting in society. So I'm just wanting to know, how does that impact your resilience? How does that makes you sustainable in terms of, for instance, we're now having a water crisis. I would go back to think if these things are accidents, and that's why it's called accident. Like, we don't know how and when or if it would happen, but it would be good if when we're thinking about development or we're thinking about initiatives, how are we ensuring that these things are taken into consideration? How are we inserting all the possible what ifs into these big ideas? So for instance, like Boness, they seem to be more, and this is just from seeing the news, more adversely affected, because we saw this long line on TV where this group went in and they were giving them water, and people were saying they can't shower and they can't think. All of these things that add to the dignity of individuals' daily living, right? If you look at the population of Bowness as it relates to economics, it's probably a community that is characterized by poverty, crime. Is that kind of where to see where that goes when you're thinking about community development? Like, why were they more adversely affected than, and again, I could be wrong, but just from my seeing, that's what it looks like to me, that they were more adversely affected. On the news, who do you see most talking? Women or women presenting. I don't know what gender they identify as, but I'm sure there are other gender diverse folks who would be included in those conversations of how this affect them. So how are we able to withstand certain things? For instance, we're in a climate crisis, right? So different things are happening. So it's fire, it's flooding, it's all these different things that are happening. Who are more adversely affected? Women and other gender diverse or marginalized genders, right? So that's why it is important that when we're looking at these things, how can we strike a balance? Because equity is striking that balance, and that balance is struck by ensuring that folks have everything that they need. All right, so some of the barriers and challenges to achieving gender equality in community development. So when we look at gender equality or gender equity in community development, there are cultural, social, and economic aspects of it. With this, we have deeply ingrained stereotypes, and I mentioned that earlier, and biases that perpetuate inequality. So we can look at women's limited access to resources. We can look at other marginalized genders, access to specific resources that meets their need. We look at different economic opportunities that exist. We can also look at health and wellness. So that when you look at that, is a limited or no access to proper healthcare and reproductive information. And we often find that, like, rural community development is way different from urban, because in terms of having access, when I just moved here, I lived in Lethbridge. And when I worked with youth, and we had to take our youth from Lethbridge, that's a 2-hour drive, to the hospital here. So how many people have the resources to benefit that? So what you find is that people don't, because you can't access, you can't make informed decision, because without having access or knowledge or education around certain things, you can't make informed decision. So people stay away from like going to the doctor, stay away from doing all these different things that will contribute to their total health and well-being. You look at the political. So underrepresentation of women and other gender diverse folks in decision-making positions and in politics. Where are these missing voices? Like, we have all these people making these decision, but the people, and representation matters. I remember an incident with my son, and he was struggling at school, and it was right along the time when what's the name, Black Panther came out. And I took him to the movie, and I'm like, hey, there is the Black Panther. His skin color is like yours, his ear is like yours. He can be a superhero, you know, just to try to it did so much for him. So representation matters. When you see people who look like you in spaces, it helps to let you know that I can achieve this. If this person can do it, I can do it too. So when you see women in politics, when you see people from the 2S LGBT community, when you see people who are non-binary or whatever we're living in, when you see those folks in representation or in leadership position, it makes a difference. We can also look at like discriminatory laws and stigma, and this one is specific to 2S LGBTQ community. When you see those discriminatory laws that are being made, and even now with Alberta and them repealing the act, like, how does that affect people who are living within that space? You know, how do we create initiatives? How do we develop community that support and, you know, not just become allies? Because when sometimes we say ally, because we can say it and it's easy to say, but when we're saying that, what does it mean to us? What does that look like for us when we say we're allies, or, you know, we're, 5 minutes left. All right, so gender mainstreaming. So just quickly jump into this. So like, what is gender mainstreaming? So with gender mainstreaming, and how does that integrate into community development, is that with gender mainstreaming, it takes on a gender equality perspective at all levels and stages of community development, of community itself. So that includes politics, economics, policies, programs, projects. So when you're doing gender mainstreaming, it falls within all aspects. How are we mainstreaming gender within all of those things? So women, men, and other marginalized genders have different needs, living conditions, circumstances, and that includes unequal access and control over power, resources, human rights, and institutions. That includes the justice system. So example, with women and men, they differ according to country, region, culture, ethnic, sociology, religious, takes along all into consideration all those things. The aim of gender mainstreaming is to take into account the differences when you're designing and implementing or evaluating policies, programs, and projects, so that they benefit everyone, right? So it's not just some people's needs are being prioritized. So gender mainstreaming, with that, it aims to solve, or even there's sometimes like those hidden gender inequalities. They might not be as hidden as we thought, but those subtle undertone of gender equalities. So with gender mainstreaming, it helps to also bring those to light, and then we can work on solving those. So some tools, so principles of gender mainstreaming. So again, that gender sensitive language. So if, for instance, I know this comes from socialization. So we tend to say, hey guys, like we're now within a space where that might work if you're within your own little tribe or your own little posse. But when you're in a general thing, so the word I use now, I say folks. So that's all inclusive. If you identify as something that's outside of that, then you'd have to fill me in, but with gender sensitive language and using people's pronoun or using the pronoun that they want to be identified with versus trying to stick to, hey, that's what I see you as. And again, it can take some time to get used to, but the intention is that you're working and you're being intentional. So again, inclusive and meaningful participation using gender analysis and again, having gender sensitive programming. I just want to go so fast because now this thing needs to go back. So strategies to implement a gendered approach in community development, community engagement, talking to the people who is being affected, gender responsive infrastructure, doing gender analysis, we spoke about that, capacity building, inclusive participation, and having gender responsive policy development and program. And even within that policy, not just creating something that is going to sit on a shelf, because I realize if we want something to go unnoticed, the best kept secrets are in books. If you don't want people to know about it, write it somewhere and put it down. Nobody reads. Even if the sign is right on the door, nobody reads, right? So how are we ensuring that those things are working? Okay, so how are we measuring the impact or what are these?
Okay, everyone. Hello, hello.